The present had become unbearable. Persecuted for their Christian faith by the Roman Emperor Decius, 7 men and a dog escaped into the mountains, where they hid inside a cave. They fell asleep on a cold stone floor. They slept in Ephesus, in Turkey, near the site of the Dormition. They slept while Mary Magdalene, from her grave, kept watch. They slept while the temples to the old gods were sacked. Others say it wasn't in Ephesus at all, but in Apsus, a place further to the east. Or it was in Fis, the birthplace of Kurdish separatism, as Kurdish Saladin TV, a YouTube channel, reports. They slept in Amman, argues an archaeologist from Amman. In the 1960s, he dug up the skeleton of their dog, Kit Mir. They slept in Cyprus and in northern Afghanistan and in the hills of Grenada at Loha. They slept on the Sabr Mountains in Yemen. They slept in Santorini. And the night grew long and old and miraculous. They slept by the side of the Silk Road in Xinjiang, while raisins dried in the sun. They slept in every house on the Comoro Islands. They fell asleep in Glastonbury, under the Chalice Well. They were weary from building a church out of twigs. They slept over Damascus in a crypt on Mount Kasiyun. The only sound was the footsteps of centuries entering and exiting the stage. They slept on a marble altar in Bavaria, in positions of overwrought repose. They slept in Cairo, in a cave in the Muqattam Hills, once occupied by the Bektashi Sufis and now by the Egyptian military. They slept through the call of the muezzin who cries, "Prayer is better than sleep." They were on their way to the future. When they awoke, the men argued over how long they had slumbered. Was it a few hours or was it a day? They were famished. When they ventured out for food, they startled a passerby as their beards were flowing down to their feet and their fingernails had become serpentine. Their city was unrecognizable. A new Christian emperor by the name of Theodosius II had ascended to the throne. Their homes had vanished, and all their loved ones were dead. Was it all a dream? How long had they slept? The story appears in the 18th chapter of the Quran, where God tells of how he redirected the path of the sun so that it wouldn't shine into the cave, and flipped the sleepers periodically so they wouldn't be afflicted with bed sores. Only God knows how long they have tarried, the verses relate. But then God gives an answer of 309 years. Historically speaking, as pedantic scholars such as Edward Gibbon have pointed out, the duration between the regimes of Decius and Theodosius were 2 centuries, not 3. Gibbon says they slept for 187 years. Or maybe it is God who has no sense of time. The earliest surviving record of the tale is found in the work of the Syriac poet Jacob of Serug from around 500 CE. For Jacob, and other early narrators of the story in Syriac, Greek, and Latin, speculation as to what the future would like was inseparable from the question, would we all resurrect? The 7 men returned from a cadaverous sleep, or was it death itself, to deliver a sermon on this very subject. They gave a lecture to the new emperor on how God had raised them as proof that the physical rising of the dead was possible, that of Christ and of all of us to come at the end of days. Then they swooned and fell back into sleep to await the second coming. The sleepers were futurists, according to the definition of the word, as it was first used in English, to mean those who believe that the prophecies of Revelation are still to be fulfilled in the future. They were amorously impatient for the apocalypse, so they woke up early, wrote the Orientalist Louis Massignon. Their story became contagious, like a global yawn. The sleepers appear in Anglo-Saxon charms and Urdu talismans, in Russian Orthodox hymns, and in the tales of the 1001 Nights. In the 16th century, on the streets of Istanbul and the courts of Isfahan, fortune tellers would predict the future using the Falnama, or the Book of Omens. One would let the book fall open to a random illustration. If it landed on the sleepers and their dog Khidmir, your luck was auspicious and the future was bright. To this day, caves around the world compete for the claim to the original darkness that pickled the sleepers, propped up by state-sponsored archaeologists and ministries of tourism. But somehow, as stories go, the sleepers fall flat. In the Quran, the verses begin with a question: "Or dost thou think the men of the cave and the inscription were among our signs a wonder?" And it ends with a plea: "Say, it may be that my Lord will lead me unto something nearer to guidance than this." It was not much of a miracle, the verses seem to say. We can find much more wondrous things on earth than a long nap. Is it possible for a story to be a failure? Something about it is unsatisfying. We tell it because it is so. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution, Martin Luther King Jr. declared in a speech in 1965. He pointed his finger at Rip Van Winkle, who, in Washington Irving's tale, slept for 20 years and missed the American Revolution. Profound transformations were underway in the world, the Reverend King continued, from decolonization to the civil rights movement. Those who couldn't cast aside their prejudices and get with the times were on the wrong side of history, the side that slept. Yet to come to Rip's defense, in Irving's story, the heroically lazy character embodies a certain perspective that everyone lacks. Thanks to his nap, Van Winkle is uniquely able to compare two moments in time. Everyone seems to barely remember their past, Van Winkle realizes, but he can make astute observations as to what's changed for the better and what's changed for the worst as America's history unfolds. The sleeper, it seems, is the ultimate social critic, even if he has missed most of what happened. In Basra in the 10th century, a secret society of philosophers who rejected the violent sectarian conflicts of their age declared themselves the sleepers of the cave. In the aftermath of the murder of the Prophet's family at Karbala in 680, the Ikhwan al-Safa, or Brethren of Purity, imagined, projecting themselves onto the past, that they had chosen to fall asleep and to reject as corrupt everything that had subsequently happened in the history of Islam. Their sleep was a protest, a self-imposed exile in the dark. In Turkey, in 1929, suddenly the future, some claimed, had arrived too fast. Under Ataturk's breakneck secularizing policies, a vast restructuring of society was underway. With rapid speed, new methods of keeping time were imposed, the Turkish language unrecognizably transformed, and many felt a profound sense of dislocation. Authors such as Refik Halit Karay, who used a Rip Van Winkle-like character to compare the Ottoman Empire to the new Turkish Republic in a controversial play, were forced into exile. A year later, a band of Sufi dervishes calling themselves the Sleepers of the Cave led a violent revolt against the reforms. They called for the restoration of the caliphate and Islamic law, the reopening of Sufi shrines, and a return to old ways of life. As they marched on Izmir, they picked up a dog named Khidmir along the way. But the Turkish army soon violently suppressed the sleeper cell. That same year, a young Egyptian playwright, Tawfiq al-Hakim, had just finished writing Amal Khalaf, or The People of the Cave. It would forever be remembered as a famous flop on stage. When it premiered in 1935 at the Cairo Opera House, people in the audience fell asleep. But as a literary text, it would enter the Arabic canon. Some consider it to be the first modern Arabic play. In al-Hakim's retelling of the legend, the sleepers are three, and when they awaken after 309 years, they must come to terms with whether or not they can live in the future, a world that has converted to Christianity, but still feels cold and unfeeling to the time travelers from the cave. Quote, "We are like fish whose water has turned from sweet to salty," two of them protest, as they slip back into their den. But the third sleeper, named Mishlinia, is in love. Mishlinia had been secretly engaged to the pagan king's daughter, Prisca. When the sleepers awaken, everything has changed, but somehow Prisca is still there. It turns out that this Prisca is actually the original princess's descendant, named after her ancestor and bearing an uncanny resemblance to her. But Mishlinia remains utterly confused. As the princess tries to convince him that 309 years divide them and that she is not the same woman he loved, Mishlinia cries, "Prisca, you didn't used to be so clever. Where's your gentleness and your modesty? And what happened to your barely audible angel voice?" He is amazed to see his illiterate fiancée has become educated overnight. She carries a book in her hand. She is still as beautiful, but she has become witty and combative and lacks her old docile sweetness. Which Prisca is more desirable, the new modern version or the old traditional one? It was a question being asked of Egypt herself. In the early 20th century, everywhere it was said that Egypt was finally awakening into modernity. After an indolent 500-year nap in the shade, Egyptians had been seized by new spirits of nationalism, cultural revival, and the promise of prosperity. A new age had dawned, not only in Egypt but across the Arab world, called the Nahda, the awakening or Renaissance. In the newspapers and at the cafes, Egypt's intellectuals debated a question: how should the nation become modern without losing touch with its past? They looked to Turkey's swerve towards modernity and argued over to what extent it should be emulated or rejected. So too in literature and art. Should Egypt's artists look for inspiration to the country's many past lives? Or should they awaken fully to the present and look to the innovations of Europe, such as the form of the modern drama, to create an art that would speak to the contemporary age? Al-Hakim's play seemed a fitting parable for these questions. When Mishlinia encounters the modern Prisca, he is bewildered to find her so changed, but then he falls more in love with this futuristic princess than he ever did with the one of the past. Yet the play concludes on an ambivalent note. All three sleepers, and Prisca too, end up retreating from the future back into the cave. Soon after the play's publication, In the Cairo papers, a critic published a series of articles accusing al-Hakim of plagiarizing the plot, not from the Quran, but from one of the cult classics of sci-fi. In Edward Bellamy's 1888 novel, Looking Backward, a young man falls asleep in Boston in 1887 in a subterranean bedroom, hermetically sealed to shut out the noise of the rapidly industrializing city, which is rife with poverty and vast inequality. He awakens in the year 2000 into a socialist utopia. In a nonviolent revolution, the United States had managed to abolish capital and private property rights and eradicated hunger, laziness, and war. Bellamy's novel was deeply influential. One of the first books in America to sell 1 million copies, it persuaded many to become socialists. The book provoked innumerable sequels and indebted works and imitations. The best known among them is H.G. Wells' When the Sleeper Wakes. But in the Cairo papers, the critic concluded that al-Hakim's biggest problem was not that he stole from Bellamy, but that he hadn't plagiarized enough. The playwright should have used the sleepers to reflect on the struggle of labor against the exploitation of capital and the miseries of Egypt's peasant class, the critic argued. He wrote, "Looking Backward is brilliant because it highlights the contrast between socialism and capitalism through the difference in years. But what did this author of The People of the Cave, may God and art forgive him, what did he want to show? What was the point of this ruse of 300 years? To some, the dreams of al-Hakim's sleepers seemed too empty. His politics lacked a utopia. This soporific myth is powerful, the critic implied, and if you deploy it, you better have something more instructive to say." Undeterred, the tireless al-Hakim would go on to publish a sci-fi counterpart to the play in 1958, inspired by the launch of the first satellite, Sputnik, by the Soviet Union. In Voyage to Tomorrow, a rocket ship carrying 2 men crash lands on a post-apocalyptic planet. When the men miraculously manage to return to Earth, they discover 309 years have passed. The archaic astronauts find themselves in a world in which money has been abolished. Everything is always available via machines, and humans no longer need to work. The play seems to reflect al-Hakim's growing disenchantment with the Nasserist Revolution, which had begun 6 years earlier. The characters are dismayed at how tradition has been sacrificed at the altar of progress. One of them plots to restore humanity to its old ways of life and ends up in exile. The future is no longer a vague word, al-Hakim declared in the mid-1980s, not long before his death. Quote, "It is an active, moving machine that stands on 2 feet before us in the image of young people who will live in the year 2000 and beyond." Ever since he was a child, al-Hakim believed he had oracular powers. Among his last works, written in the early Mubarak years, were essays on how a revolution would be united by the young. In Tunis in 2011, after a 26-year-old street vendor lit himself on fire, a group of artists calling themselves Amal Khalaf, or the people of the cave, took to the streets at night. Covering the city with collages and stencils of the martyrs and the falling dictators of the Arab Spring. They posted a manifesto on Facebook. Ahl Khalaf is not an amount of people, it is a generation. They will emerge from debris and emerge as ululations, marginal prophets from a new era. The sleepers, marginal prophets, continue to be a way to reflect on political awakenings, a way to critique the present and imagine what will come. The future, at the moment, looks sleepless. 24/7 capitalism has killed or else commodified sleep. We cultivate insomnia, a kind of vigilance against the violence of a world that is always on digital display. We value instantaneity, instant gratification that we share and scroll through in the night. Why dwell on a story that hinges on a sense of duration? There exists only the instant, Louis Massignon remarked in 1951. For the Muslim theologian, time is not a continuous duration, but a constellation, a galaxy of instants, he continued, referring to figures such as the 11th century Sufi mystic al-Qushayri. In such a cosmos, Massignon explained, only the moment exists, for every atom is created anew at every second. The appearance of continuity between one point and the next is upheld only by God. These philosophers condemned as materialists anyone who believed in a sense of duration, Massignon related. So there is no certainty that the future will even remotely resemble the past. This is either good news or it is terrifying. That the world is made anew at every moment is the logic of 24 capitalism and certain Sufi metaphysics, but it is also the logic of the dream, in which a century can pass in the instant between flipping from one's right side to one's left. If a story fails, just make it new. It is possible, the sleeper's hint, and I hope Martin Luther King will forgive me, that revolution begins with reverie. Mundane sleep is the nightly rehearsal of what more consequential renewals and beginnings might be. Thank you.